Minasan, Ohayo. Today I'd like to share with you a game guide called Life in Vana'diel. A game guide for Final Fantasy XI. This was one of the first purchases I ever made when coming to Japan. In fact, as I was looking through this before this video, I found a receipt from 2005. Now, this receipt is not for the purchase of the book. The two items are coffee, some aloe vera gel, I again don't remember, skincare product, which I do not remember buying. But this was in Shinagawa, and again the year 2005, which matches, from what I remember, the time I would have bought this book. So today we're looking at nearly 20-year-old game guide for Final Fantasy XI. This was the first MMORPG I ever played. I had played many other Final Fantasies, like most American video game fans who grew up around the same era that I did. I played my first Final Fantasy game on Super Nintendo. It was Final Fantasy II, and I went on to play Final Fantasy III. My first large purchase after getting a part-time job in high school was a PlayStation 1 in order to play Final Fantasy VII. I played 8. I played Final Fantasy X on PlayStation 2, the game just prior to this one. But this was the first online game I ever played. In, I believe, 2004 was when it was released on PlayStation 2. I can say without exaggeration, I logged many hundreds of hours on this game. So this game guide here, and it's not a strategy guide, it's much more about the world and the lore of the game. So I would like to share that with you today. So if you're interested in a little nostalgia, as well as some Japanese video game culture, please join me as we look through Life in Vana'diel. So let's take a look inside. This gives you an idea of the graphics, the level at this game. It was a PlayStation 2 game. I think it was designed for that level of graphics, but at the time it was quite fun. So the book starts, like I said, it's a lore book. It's not a strategy guide. It's giving you information about some basic parts of the game as far as cities and characters. But it's not a strategy guide. It's mostly just about some of the background. And we start with the nations, the starting cities when playing the game. And, quite appropriate, the first one in this book, the starting city that I began in nearly 20 years ago, Sandoria. Sandoria was, again, the first city I played in. And something I liked about it, if you look here, you can see there's a sort of symmetry in many of the areas in this city that didn't exist in the other ones. It honestly made for an easy city to start in. As I said earlier, this was the first MMORPG I'd ever played, so anything to make it a bit easier was helpful. So it was very easy to get around, I thought, in this city. The book talks about the racial distribution, the different in-game races, and the largest one here, 80%. This was an Elvan city. basically you can see they've got the long ears, sort of an elven influence. You can think of the night elves from Warcraft or the Tolkien books with the elves. But something I always enjoyed about this, the designers for this game took a much different kind of design style with the elves. Again, when we think of elves in media, they're very mystical and sort of not of this world, sort of aloof from things. In this game, it was quite different. They were the more kind of rational ones, very martial. You can see in the design here, this doesn't look anything like what we're used to with elven decor in different media. It's much more harsh right angles, stonework, and so on. So that was something I always enjoyed about this game. They tried something different with what we usually think of with elves. Here we've got some different characters that were part of, again, the lore in this game. I don't remember many of these. I remember Ronfaure. He came up. He was the Dragon King, I believe they called him. He was in some quests. He's a dragoon. I don't remember him. I remember Exenmil. Exenmi? Again, there's a sort of French influence to a lot of the pronunciation that, fortunately, the katakana has the phonetic parts of it, and it sounds like it does have a sort of French influence, but Exenmi? I usually said Exenmil because I didn't know how to say it. He came up a lot in the game and several expansions later as well. And again, like I said, there's a sort of symmetry to the city that made getting around, again, a bit easier here. Spent a lot of time going to these two areas here, the gates to West Ronfaure and East Ronfaure. Again, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. I always just called them West Ron and East Ron. The music for both of these areas, it's the same piece of music, but it was a wonderful bit of music. It was something straight out of a Renaissance fair. Something you could hear or imagine hearing at a medieval wedding or a feast. I'll put a link in the description below to the music for this area, but it was another just wonderful part of the game. I remember still, first time I went into that wilderness area to fight bunnies and worms, the lowest enemies in this part of the game, and just hearing that stirring music for the first time. I think you'll really enjoy it, and I'll put a link in the description to it. But again, a symmetry to this city that made it a bit easier to play in. There's the crystal. That's where, when you died, and you would die often in this game, that's where you would restart. It was your home point, it was called. Again, here, not exactly as symmetrical as the other parts, but it's still a bit easy to get around. You've got central areas and things branching off of that. Here's something else I really liked about the design choice. The Sandorian Cathedral. The design of this, you can see here, kind of a little bit more how it looked in game. There was a very European feel to it, a very papal kind of feel that it might seem uninspired in a fantasy game, in a Final Fantasy game, but at the same time I always thought it was interesting, especially when this was the elves. You wouldn't think of a cathedral like this as a place for the elves to have their religion, but it was, again, something I always enjoyed about the game. Port Santoria, you see this large water area here, the airship docks. Traveling in between cities in this game it took a long time, But each city had an airship that would land, and even though they flew, they were essentially boats, and they would land in the water. And each city had a water area where you would catch the airship to each one. The Chateau de... Again, I'm going to murder this pronunciation. Diorgiru. The katakana is more Diorgiru. Diorgi. Again, I always just said Diorgil. It was the family name. That's actually this part here next to the cathedral was a separate zone or an area you could go into. The different guilds, the crafting in Final Fantasy XI. Like everything in this game, crafting was an absolute time sink. It took months, if not years, to max out a craft, a guild. Well, not the guild, but the craft itself. But each city had different guilds. Guilds would give you, I believe, a buff that if you spoke with them and paid, they gave you something that helped your crafting a little bit. Sandoria had woodworking, the Carpenter's Guild, the Tanner's Guild, leatherworking, and then the Blacksmith's Guild. Smithing, basically, carpenters. For this, mostly you made lumber and then furnishings. You had a small residential area, house, a Mog house, actually with a Moogle inside. You mostly made things that gave you more storage or buffs in that place. Tanner's was leatherworking, shields. No, I take that back. Not shields. Leather armor. The kind of medium light armor for thieves, that kind of thing. As well as parchment that was an ingredient for many other things in the game. That was one thing as well. A lot of the different guilds created items that were recipes for other guilds. It was very intertwined. Blacksmithing, armor, swords, parts, that sort of thing. But these were the 3 guilds of Sandoria. Sandorian military here, just some things about some lore about the city and its governance, I suppose. Something here again, the Papsk of Sandoria, that cathedral we looked at a few moments ago. That's here you have the temple knights. They were like the religious order of knights, whereas they also had the royal knights. It was this distinction between the two, of which again I don't quite remember. It's been nearly 20 years, but again, not something you would really think about with elves. At least wasn't something that I quite thought about that way. So that was our first city, our first starting city, Sandoria. And now we come to Bastok. I had actually been mispronouncing this word as Bastok for many years until I finally saw it spelled phonetically with the katakana Bastok. Bastok was home to Humes for the most part, but also Galka. Galka were these large people in the game. They had tails. They were much larger than the other races in the game. As far as some of the more famous ones, here we find the ever-present Cid, a character who's been in, I believe, every Final Fantasy game in some sort of iteration. Always an engineer, some kind of inventor. He was in this game as well in that same sort of capacity. I mentioned earlier how I had preferred Sandoria being more symmetrical and easier to get around in. You can see the difference here with Bastok, where you've got this diagonal entrance to the city. I was always frequently checking my map when I had to come to the city here. Port Bastok, again, the airship landing area, this water area. I think, if I remember correctly, this drawbridge would rise and lower, like in an animation, as the ship approached and also departed. The metalworks, this was where you could find Sid. This was similar to the Chateau de Orgai, I can't pronounce it, from Sandoria, and similar to the next city we'll see, Heaven's Tower in Windurst. The 3 guilds in Bastok. You had the Alchemist's Guild, made potions, sneak potions, invisible powders, as well as regular potions as well to restore MP. And I also believe they made the bullets for guns in the game. Eventually in the game you do get guns, or certain classes do. I believe alchemy was responsible for crafting those. I love this development artwork here, the sketches you get for these different design choices in game. This one especially here with the laboratory, the different flasks and beakers, I guess, and even a cauldron. Very interesting. Goldsmith's Guild. This was one of the more difficult crafts to level in the game. Very expensive, relied upon a lot of more of the rare mined metals, the precious metals in the game, if you will, as well as jewels and so on. There was a lot of good gear to be had from goldsmithing, but it was quite expensive to level this craft. And just like Sandoria, there's also a blacksmith's guild in Bastok. Some information about the Bastokan military. It has a very Roman kind of style to it. You've got a legion, legatus overall, and praefectus, centurions, and so on. And finally we come to Windurst, the Star Sibyl, who was the leader of Windurst. Windurst was home to the Taru, as well as the Mithra. The Taru were small characters in the game. The Mithra were, as many Japanese games and anime have, they were cat people. And in this game, they were only women. There were no cat men. I believe there was some lore within a quest line indicating that the Mithra men were all back home on some island. But in this game, you could only create women for Mithra characters. The popular characters, again, I'm not too clear on many of these except for Shantoto. Shantoto came up in several quest lines in the game, as well as a quite memorable cutscene where she infiltrates a beastmen's stronghold, a Yagudo castle, and makes quick work of everyone inside. She was a fairly popular character and well-known one in this game. Again, this common lament you've heard me making, but these other cities were always difficult for me to get around, and I found myself checking my map frequently in the cities other than Sandoria. In Port Windurst here, where you had the airship landing, where you would catch the airship to travel. Heaven's Tower. This is the similar area in this city too. For example, the metalworks in Bastok, or the Chateau d'Orgil. I'm butchering that pronunciation. In Sandoria, the design with this place was always really interesting. It was sort of a magical observatory, and as the artwork shows here, it was really one of the more visually pleasing places in Windurst. I thought, even though most of Windurst was an interesting place to be within a lot of water, there was even a zoo in one section. I believe Windurst Walls. There was a section with here was the Dommel Farm. It wasn't a zoo. You had these giraffe-like creatures. Dommels were an enemy. Well, not an enemy, a beast that you could fight outside of town, but there was this area inside with them walking around. I always thought was kind of interesting. So it was a nice city to be in. There was things to look at and so on, but it was really the Heaven's Tower that I found was really impressive inside, with this design choice for a magical observatory where the various wizards and mages, what have you, would observe the heavens or the stars. That was where you found the Star Sibyl. She was the leader of Windurst. Heaven's Tower can be found at the entrance here in Windurst Walls. And then the different guilds of Windurst. You had the Weavers Guild, Clothcraft, created a lot of the cloth armor that casters would wear. Boneworkers Guild. This was an interesting craft I don't believe I'd seen in other games before. They made a lot of accessories, the earrings or the rings, in addition to goldsmithing that could be worn by players. But there was some decent armor as well, kind of medium armor that came from bonecraft. The Scorpion Harness, for example, a popular piece at level, I believe 65, I'm not sure, came from boneworking. And of course the Culinarians Guild. Like most RPGs, there's cooking that can be done to offer various buffs or beneficial effects to players. Final Fantasy was no different. These three guilds found in Windurst. Again, I love this artwork here. This for the different guilds. You've got some kind of large oven here, some bone working information. Fisherman's Guild. Yes, this was fishing was not a craft. It was a gathering class in the game, but they did have a guild and I believe some quests with it as well. As long as you leveled, there were other gathering classes. Well, they weren't classes, but there was mining and logging, but they didn't have the depth with them that fishing did. Fishing, again, came with quests. In fact, there was a mythic quest for a mythical fishing pole, Liu Shang's fishing rod. Whereas mining and logging, you bought a hatchet or an axe from a shop, or you crafted them yourself, and you went and gathered those materials. But fishing was also part of Windurst. So now that we've arrived at Jueno, we'll talk a little bit about this area. Jueno was the next area players progressed to in the game. Right around level 20, there were a few things important about Jueno at level 20. It was where the Chocobo quest was available at that level. Up until arriving at Jueno and completing the Chocobo quest, players were forced to brave the wilds, simply walk through wilderness areas with enemies that were much stronger than them. The quest in Jueno allowed for a chocobo license, I believe it was called. And even though chocobos were available in every city, some of the smaller towns and villages, and even at some of the telepoints, players could not utilize them until they completed this quest in Jueno. So Jueno was important in progression for that, for access to chocobos. The chocobo quest took a while. It was, I believe, several game days, and an in-day game was, I want to say, maybe an hour, 45 minutes. So it was the quest took a while to complete. So that was one reason for Jueno. The next was, it was the next logical progression point for XP parties. This area here might be difficult to read. Quifim Island. I'm not very sure on the pronunciation of that, but that was a leveling area accessible through Jueno, and the level range there was, I believe, level 20 to, I know, 25. I believe you could stay there to level 30. I'm not quite, I can't quite remember, it's been so long, but so both of those reasons, the chocobo license and the leveling progression in Quifim Island, made Jueno the next step for players to go at level 20. Jueno was very easy to navigate around. This section here, Rulud Gardens, was essentially a square with some places around at the auction house. And then the other parts, Upper Jueno, Lower Jueno, and then Port Jueno. It's difficult to see with these maps, these artist renditions, but each of these areas were essentially long thoroughfares. In the in-game lore, they were bridges connecting different parts of the continent, but each one of these was just a long sort of avenue with all of the things you needed, the quests, the shops, the auction house, and so on, off to the sides of this, either to the right or left. So Jueno was very easy to navigate. Another interesting thing, each one of these levels, these different areas, upper, lower, port, connected to each of the 3 starting cities that we just discussed. Now, they didn't connect directly, but depending on the starting city you came from, you would arrive at Jueno at different places. For example, Upper Jueno connected to Battalia Downs. This was the route that I took from Sandoria as a level 20 player, whereas Lower Jueno, connected to Rolandberry Fields. Rolandberry connected to the various areas, eventually leading to Bastok. And finally, for players arriving from the Windurst areas, they came from more strange pronunciation with this game, Sauramugu Champagne. Sauramugu being the name of the place. Sauramugu, the katakana is Sauramugu. Sauramug Champagne. I have never heard of a geographical term for champagne, but there it is. So that was another fun part of the city, was it was situated sort of equally distant from, isn't that a word? Equidistant, I'm not sure, but it was equally was located in a central point from each major city, each of the 3 starting cities. So there was no route that was perhaps safer or easier than the other. Again, to arrive here, you did not have access to chocobos yet. You needed to take a level 20 character through several areas with monsters, enemies much higher level than that. So you needed either an escort or silent oils and prism powders. Those were ways to sneak past enemies. I remember when I made the trip to Jueno, I just stuck to the road and ran whenever I was aggroed by an enemy. It was a fun little trip. Final Fantasy was a punishing game. If you died, you lost a lot of XP. And so going off into the wilds to reach a new area, there was risk, in-game risk. There was no real risk, but there was a risk involved of loss of time, basically, with loss of XP. So I remember quite clearly, even after the many hours I played and the many things I've forgotten about the game, I still remember at level 20 going from Sandoria to Lethen Plateau, through Jugner Forest, and then finally to Battalia Downs, and arriving at Jueno the first time. So Jueno was quite an interesting city. Here in Port Jueno, if you remember, we looked at the different port areas for each of the major cities. Port Bastok, Port Windurst, Port Sandoria. These are where the airships landed. You notice there's 4 berths, 4 landing areas for the airships here in Port Jueno. 3 of these are for major cities, Windurst, Sandoria, Bastok. And then the 4th one was for a place called Khazam. Khazam we will discuss in the next section. But that is Jueno. That is Jueno. One more interesting thing that we're going to discuss a bit later was the auction house in Jueno was where you found the best gear, the best items at this time. Now in the future there were more expansions and other auction houses, but at this time the best gear, the most rare loot, treasure, was to be found at the auction house in Jueno. We'll go into that a bit later because there was an interesting sort of phenomenon that occurred, or that evolved, I should say, with the auction house in Jueno, but we'll come to that in a bit. So that is the city of Jueno. And briefly, some of the other areas in Final Fantasy at this time: Selbina, Mhaura, Khazam. Rabao we're going to come back to a bit later. There's some more things going on here that I'd like to discuss, but Selbina, Mhaura, and Khazam. Selbina was a quite busy place during the time of this expansion, Rise of the Zalart. The zone just outside of Selbina, the Valkurm Dunes, was a very popular leveling location. XP parties would go there from levels 10 to 20, thereabouts. So this meant the city, the village of Selbina, often had many people there, so this was a pretty busy place. Mhaura, on the other hand, not as much. There wasn't a lot to do in this zone. I believe it was designed to be a leveling location similar to Valkurm Dunes, but because Selbina sat in the center of where Bastok and Sandoria were located on the map, people just gravitated here, and so Mhaura was a lot less populated. Now, this is not the case today in 2023 on Final Fantasy. I've mentioned earlier that the servers are still running, the game is still going fairly strong, and Mhaura is generally packed. There is an activity there now called Ambuscade. Ambuscade is a popular and pretty easy way to just grind out some very decent gear in-game. So Mhaura these days is pretty busy, but not during the time of this expansion. Khazam, very similar to Selbina, another busy area due to the zone just outside of the city. A popular leveling location from, I believe, levels 25 to 30, if my memory serves. So Khazam was another place that people went to. Basically, after they finished the area outside Jueno from Qufim, you would go to Khazam and spend a lot of time just outside the gate fighting Mandragoras, Mandies, very cute little enemies in the Final Fantasy XI game. Also goblin smithies were out there as well. And I mentioned earlier, but this 4th airship berth here was the one that took you to Khazam. So these 3 areas here: Selbina, Khazam, and Mhaura. 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 I'm not sure exactly how to say that in English, but these three areas here. Now, the next part I want to talk about is the city of Rabao. This small village was near the Al-Tepa Desert, and that could be reached from a tunnel from Bastok, the Koraloka tunnel, if I remember correctly. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about Rabao separate from these other areas was there was a very sort of famous in-game exploit that was occurring here that made several people a lot of money, in-game money. Gil was the currency in Final Fantasy games. It was not uncommon during, again, this time, the rise of the Zalart era, the beginning of that era, to see this oasis here within Rabao to be full of players, surrounded by dozens, sometimes perhaps even 100 players, all fishing in this oasis. Now, what some players discovered was when fishing here, a player could fish up a rusty cap. Now, this was, I can't remember if this was equipable, if you could actually wear it, but it was a piece of gear that could be repaired into gear that could be worn. It was originally, I believe, just supposed to be some kind of trash item that you could fish up. But players discovered by using a light crystal, I think a single light crystal, and a recipe from blacksmithing, that you could turn that rusty cap into a padded cap. Now, this wasn't some great piece of armor, but what it was that you could sell it to an NPC. You could vendor it for, I don't know the price, but significantly more than the price of the bait to catch the original cap. So what players would do, they'd sit here for days on end fishing up these rusted caps, repairing them into padded caps, fill their inventory, and then just go sell them all to the vendor to make gil. They'd come back, do it again, and during the time this was, I guess it was an exploit. It was not a bug, but during the time this was active, this part of the of Rabao was full of people fishing up these rusted caps to change into padded caps. Now, I was a new low-level player during this time, and this had even filtered down to someone at my level in the game. So I imagine that means it must have been going on for quite a long time. So a lot of people, what I heard, made a lot of gil doing this. Now, I was too low to even really get there and take advantage of this, but I had some friends tell me once in game, or maybe it was just one friend, and it's purely anecdotal. There's a lot of gossip that happens in these kind of games, but one friend had told me that he knew of a player who had maxed out their gil, the money they could hold in game, by doing this. Now, whether that's true, I honestly don't know, but the amount of people who spent time here doing this makes me think that it was pretty lucrative. And it was interesting, a lot of people back at this time talked about, at least on our server, that this was when inflation really happened with a lot of items on the auction house. Now, with Final Fantasy XI, it was not easy to make gil. Quests gave very little, if any, gil. Items being sold to vendors weren't worth very much. So any way that a player had to make gil was very useful, and usually it came from just selling things on the auction house to other players. So anything like this that introduced a lot of currency sort of externally that might not have been there before, could that have had an effect on inflation or prices in game? I have no idea. Again, I was so new to the game at this time that I really don't know, but it was a very interesting phenomena that I wanted to comment about Rabao. This whole idea that a bunch of players figured out a way to get large amounts of in-game currency relatively easy. You needed to level your fishing to a certain level. You needed to level your smithing to a certain level. And then after that, the only real bottleneck I could see would be the light crystals. I don't believe that many enemies in the game dropped light crystals. There were a few. And as for the elementals, light elementals were very rare in the game. We'll talk about that a bit later when we get to the enemies in Final Fantasy, but obviously some players found out a way to get light crystals if they were able to make so much gil doing this. Yeah, I always find those kind of things interesting, the kind of workarounds or kind of, again, exploits that players find, especially in MMOs. MMO RPG players are pretty industrious about finding any little advantage they can, and this was one of those I always found a bit interesting. The Rabao fishing, again, exploit. There's a great website called BG, which I believe stands for Blue Garter, has a lot of Final Fantasy information. They have an actual history of this entire game where they go month by month, update by update, and talk about different parts of the game. And this Rabao one is also mentioned. Eventually, the devs found out about this and changed the rate at which you could fish up those rusted caps. They became much more rare and slow to fish up. So pretty much overnight, the entire thing sort of just dissipated, and it was no longer feasible. But yeah, so that is Rabao and the fishing, again, exploit that occurred in the early days of the Rise of the Zalart expansion. Again, I love this artwork here. Some of the sketches included in this book are really nice. Again, there's Sid from Bastok. I believe somewhere in one of the quest lines it's discussed that he helped Jueno develop the airships and the travel between cities. The airships were useful, but nothing really happened on them. You got on board, it was an instance, so you flew across the map, and then you arrived. That was really it. To the point where a lot of people tried to go AFK when they were on the airship, and how this would work at the dock. You would try to center here even if the airship hadn't arrived yet, because I believe they were about 5 or 10 minutes between each one, so it was a bit to wait. And just waiting here didn't guarantee you got on. You had to wait for the airship to land, to load, I guess, and then actually get on board. So most people would come to this section here, get as centered as they could, and then just auto walk or auto run straight ahead, and then go do something else and come back in 10 or 15 minutes, and you'd generally be at your destination. Now, you could mess up and end off running up in a corner and not getting on board, but it was generally easy enough to just auto run to get on the airship. Again, a different time in video games. But yeah, these are the airships. Again, love that artwork. Oh, that's great. The black and white version, just the pencil, or the ink and pen, and then you got the color down here. It looks great. It doesn't really look that bad either. Even, it's a PS2 game, but it didn't really look that bad. Oh, the ferry, Selbina and Mhaura. We talked about these two places here. There was actually a ferry that ran between them. It was really one of the quickest ways, well, maybe not the quickest, but before teleporting and airship travel, to get from Selbina, which was connected through several zones, to Bastok and Sandoria, to Mhaura, which was connected to Windurst. And the ferry was fun. Things actually did happen on the ferry. You could fish from the ferry. You'd often see people leveling their fishing skill on the ferry. It was a place for, I believe, a certain level range where, I apologize, there's a Kukusha passing by outside. There was a level range for fishing where it was the ferry was the best place to go for that. there was enemies on board the ferry, and if you were too low level, you had to hide below decks, or else you might get killed on the ferry ride. And one that was really fun, sometimes pirates would attack. It wasn't every trip. It was random, I believe. It wasn't exceptionally rare, but out of nowhere, some ominous music would start playing, and an NPC would announce through the text box that, oh, the pirates are attacking. Stay below decks if you don't want to, if you don't want to incur their wrath or something like that. And if you were strong enough, a bunch of undead would spawn, skeletons, I believe. And if you were strong enough, you could fight them. I think some ghosts spawned also. There was also, I believe, a notorious monster, a rare spawn that could come with the pirates. I don't quite remember. There wasn't anything great from fighting them treasure-wise, and you would have to spend hours sometimes writing, just hoping to get the pirates' attack, and then hoping that the NM, the notorious monster, might spawn with the pirates. It was something I never did. But it did make this whole, it did make the ferry ride, if you ever had to take it, something fun, something interesting that could happen. About notorious monsters, we'll get into that a bit later. Final Fantasy was infamous for the bizarre conditions that needed to be met for certain rare enemies with valuable treasure to even spawn in the game. But that was the ferry between Selbina and Mhaura. Again, the airship, nothing like that happened. You just got on, ran around, maybe chatted with some other players, and you arrived. But the ferry, you had the chance of pirates. Chocobos, we talked about the Chocobo quest in Jueno. Once you got Chocobos, they were very valuable to get around in game. The auction house, we discussed this a little bit, how in Jueno was where the most expensive items were often sold. And the auction houses were not connected. I believe they are now, but in the beginning they were not. So certain places had certain things for different prices to be sold or purchased. One interesting thing about Jueno that was funny, this is the Jueno auction house here, the tax the game took from players in order to remove a bit of gil from the game was much higher in Jueno than it was the other three cities. Now this posed a problem if you were selling an expensive item. If you had some rare item that went for 5 million or 10 million gil, you could be forced to pay, was it 10%? I can't remember, but you might be paying 500,000 gil just to place it on the auction house. That wasn't a guarantee that it would sell. It wasn't a price incurred when it's sold. That was just to place it. So again, some items for those expensive prices might not sell for a long time. So how do you get around constantly dropping money on this tax just to sell it? Well, in the zones outside Jueno, people would park their players, and there was a way in game that you could sell items from your own inventory. It was called a bazaar. There'd be a little pouch above a player's head, and you could basically browse that pouch. Now, you couldn't search by item name. You would just hope something had something. But outside of Jueno, usually in Rolandberry Fields, at least on my server, you'd see 10, 15, 20, 30 players just standing around trying to sell something expensive and to dodge that tax. It was another fun little part of the game. The auction house is the Mog House. Wow, there was no bank in Final Fantasy. There was no place to store things outside of your Mog House. You had in all of the cities, you'll notice a link to what was called a residential area. Let me see if I can find it. So in Windurst Walls, residential area. That was the link to your Mog House. Any player who entered that residential area went to their own specific Mog House, and you had a Moogle inside. The Moogle held about 30 storage spaces, if I remember correctly, and then there was various quests to increase that storage space. You could add furnishings to increase the storage space as well. It became a popular place for event items, Halloween, Easter, summer. It wasn't called Halloween or Easter. They had different names for them, but Easter egg-themed gifts. Halloween had ghosts and pumpkins and so on. So by the time I finished the game when I was first playing, my Mog house was full of different event items and posters and wall hangings. But your Mog house, that was where your storage went. They give you some examples here of different furnishings. The beds were what was required to increase the space with your Moogle. Oh, here's your Moogle down here. He sat in the center of your Mog house, and each time you got a bed, it started with just a simple bed. He would go on a quest for you, they would go on a quest for you and give you, I believe, 10 more spaces of storage. The royal bed, I believe, was one of the final ones that brought it up to, I believe, 50 or 60 during this time. This is where you also went to change jobs. One of the things Final Fantasy XI, I love this, and I loved it about Final Fantasy XIV. You could play any job on one character. You didn't need to create a new character and start from scratch just to try out a new job. So, Mog houses were where you went to do that. You talked to the Moogle, and that's where you got the option to change your job. Again, it was a very fun thing about a game. It helped with gear. If there was a piece of gear you had that would be good for another job, or maybe you won some treasure from a mob, a good sword, a good piece of armor, but it wasn't on your main class. Well, maybe that gave you the reason to play it on another class. But yeah, Mog house, that's where that was, what that was useful for. And that is everything about the 3 cities and the different places. I think this is a good part to stop now. The next section is the world, Sekai. We've got actually the Heaven's Tree, is that what it's called, from Windurst? Heaven's Tower, excuse me, a picture here of Heaven's Tower. A lot more to go in this book. A lot more really great artwork that I'm excited to share with you. And if you've made it this far, and if you've not been too bored by my voice or by the things I've been talking about, hopefully you'll come back for the next video, because there really is some exciting and interesting stuff to look at here in the book, in the rest of the book. So thanks a lot, guys. Hope you enjoyed.